Good afternoon. I am Angela Copple, the Program Director for the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar entitled EMAC Overview for City and County Officials. It looks like we have a great turnout, and we value your participation in this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by NEMA, the National Emergency Management Association, in cooperation with the International City-County Management Association and the National League of Cities. Thank you to everyone for their efforts in putting this webinar together. On the NEMA side, I want to thank Paul Hogue for all of his work in coordinating and setting up the webinar. Our presenter today is Joyce Flinn. Joyce is the Response Division Administrator at the Iowa Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Joyce is also the current EMAC Executive Task Force Chair and lead for the National Coordinating State. Joyce, I'm now going to hand the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first go over the objectives with you for what we're going to be talking about today on the webinar. We're going to talk about EMAC and how it fits into the disaster response. We want to describe what EMAC can do for local jurisdictions, identify how EMAC enables interstate mutual aid, indicate how local jurisdictions can be involved in EMAC, and then, of course, as Angela said, we will conduct that question and answer session. EMAC is the cornerstone of the nation's mutual aid systems. It is nationally adopted state-to-state mutual aid compact that facilitates the effective sharing of resources across state lines during governor-declared disasters. And that is a key point there because a governor's declaration in the impacted state is the activating mechanism for using the EMAC system. Talking a little bit about the legal justification behind the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, it is Public Law 104-321, which was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1996. To belong to the compact, states had to adopt the compact language as is. It was then called the EMAC Articles of Agreement. There is no variation in I want to adopt this part, I don't want to adopt that part, so it is consistent nationwide by all states who have adopted it. As you can see there, all 50 states, Guam, District of Columbia, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico have passed EMAC into state law. There are 13 articles to the compact. Again, as we said, it does have to be passed as is. There's no variation in which parts and pieces you choose to pass. Talking about a little bit of the differences and a comparison here between an intrastate mutual aid versus interstate mutual aid. Intrastate is what's most familiar to local jurisdictions. These are often those 28E agreements where this fire department says, I'll help the neighboring fire department if they have a fire that's beyond their capabilities. Oftentimes it's city to city or city to county or county to county. And that process is regulated within that state. They may have agreements in place, and in a lot of rural areas, we know that those are often just handshake or verbal agreements between two jurisdictions. As we look at interstate mutual aid, that's the sharing of resources from one state to another. Those resources are usually state-owned, but they can be locally owned or even private resources. The state EMAC procedures may vary, but that consistent EMAC legislation is the law in all those states. So while the procedures may vary a little bit from state to state, the process and the legislation is consistent. One of the things we often hear is people say, I want EMAC resources, and we always like to stress that EMAC does not own anything. It is the member states that own the resources which are shared through the system. It is a system through which resources are shared and legally protected as they deploy from one state to another. The requesting states agree to reimburse the assisting states, and this is implemented, this process, through the State Emergency Management Agency on behalf of the governor of the state. The Emergency Management Office at the state level is an integral part of this system. As we look at this at the local level, resources may be requested through EMAC that are not available in the affected state. It may be something that's not commonly available, or it's been depleted, it's out for service, and sometimes it is just too costly for a small jurisdiction to look at getting a particular type of resource. The one thing we do often run into is we don't want to get this because it's just a cost avoidance, and it is not a way to avoid a cost, but we do realize there are a lot of constraints for local jurisdictions on what resources they can afford. As we look at this, as everyone is aware, I'm sure, all incidents are local. They start in a local jurisdiction, and they are then looking at those resources in the surrounding area to impact the response to that disaster. In most states, when you've exhausted your local resources, you can go to the State Emergency Management Office and see what resources they might be able to help with. Those are then looking at those intrastate mutual aid relationships. Can jurisdictions from the surrounding area go and support that local incident, or do they not have enough or the right resources either? In Iowa, as we look at the emergency management system, we look at local resources being utilized, and we always say to include mutual aid. So Iowa does have a statewide intrastate mutual aid compact, so neighboring jurisdictions can look to their neighbors first, and then after those resources are depleted, that's when they come to the state and ask for resources. If the state, of course, does not have the resources, then they have numerous places they can look to for resource support. Those may be the Federal Emergency Management Agency, another federal agency. It may be from the private sector through vendors, and then it can certainly be another state through the EMAC system. And for our presentation today, we're going to look at how this works through EMAC. Listed here are some of the types of commonly requested resources when you look at disasters and the kinds of things that are often needed. You know, we know that mass care and feeding are one of those very typical things that may be needed. Search and rescue, we always get requests, it seems like, for National Guard resources. So basically any resource or capability that a state has access to can be deployed through the EMAC system. Usually includes personnel, equipment, teams, systems, or again, National Guard assets. One of the things that was on that list was an A-team. A-teams are those trained emergency management personnel that are requested to go to that affected state. They deploy through the EMAC system, and they then are able to process requests for assistance from other states through the EMAC system. These personnel are actually doing the brokering of resources on behalf of that impacted state. A couple of key things to mention as we talk about that brokering of resources. Those A-teams do not make the decisions on which resources to choose or which ones are too expensive. They gather the information and take it to the officials at that impacted state who make those decisions. When we look at resources to share, local governments have the capability to share resources as well. What we encourage you to do is determine what resources you have that you can and would like to be able to deploy in support of incidents in other states. Again, the key thing is coordinating with your state emergency management agency. Make sure you're aware of enabling mechanisms in state laws, local agreements, and laws that either allow you or hinder you from deploying certain types of resources. And then we're going to talk more about developing mission-ready packages. I know in Iowa, when we look at deploying local assets, we have what's called a 28D Delta Agreement, 28D. That is a form that we complete when we're looking at deploying local resources. It makes them temporary agents of the state, so they are available for deployment through the EMAC system. When we talk about mission-ready packages, these are kind of the components of that. If you see in the middle there, this is an example of a debris removal support package. It is comprised of equipment, personnel, commodities, food, travel, lodging, and other costs. So as you look at this, the equipment piece, we've got dump trucks, loaders, cameras, chainsaws, all those equipment resources and the associated costs with those. When we look at personnel, we have to list the names of the individuals and their contact information And then we have to figure the cost for those personnel, and that usually includes salaries and fringe benefits as well. Then all that equipment, you know, doesn't operate without fuel, so it's looking at each piece and part of that resource to make sure that all the costs and all the equipment is detailed. A couple of things here. We need to capture all these components, and what you're doing is getting your best guess of an estimated cost. We know there would be a variable on the travel and lodging piece, depending on where you're traveling to, the proximity to your home state. We know that there are generally accepted equipment rates through the federal government, and we all know what rates we pay our personnel. So some of those will be more defined costs, but some of them we realize are your best guess estimate at this time. When you're talking about larger packages this way too, I know there's been an example of a mobile hospital, just the support needed at the local jurisdiction level to where that resource is going. Does it need a 100 by 100 foot area in a parking lot, a hard service parking lot, so that it can set up and be on stable ground? So any of those kinds of other support things you would need are good to include as well. What we hope to do is look for the closest, most readily available resource to fill the need, and that's the incident there, and we're getting resources from all around to quickly get there in support of the response. In this picture, we're going to show you, if you watch in the lower left corner, I believe you'll see a date here in a moment. As Superstorm Sandy was making landfall, this kind of shows the evolution of the response. When we talk about closest resource first, in this case that didn't necessarily happen for some of those East Coast states, because if you remember, they weren't sure exactly where Superstorm Sandy might make landfall. So resources came from a little bit further away, but then as you see here, they were more sure of the track than those other states along the eastern seaboard provided a lot of resource support. This will take a few minutes to run, but we had seen this at another meeting, and I suggested we include it. I think it's just a great depiction of the types of resources and how everything moved into that area very quickly in response to needs. As you can see, we're getting some resources from further away, as well as a lot of resources from the close-by area of the country. Lots of resources that moved through there very quickly. Again, my thanks to the NEMA staff for putting that together. I think it's just a great depiction of how member states reach out to help others at a time of catastrophic incident. One of the things we've learned, and we all know, is none of us have enough or the right kind of resources to impact everything. That is the same with FEMA. We do, however, coordinate very closely with FEMA. When the National Emergency Operations Center is activated, we are asked to provide a liaison to that EOC, and we often have A-team liaisons, or I'm sorry, regional EMAC liaison teams at those regional offices, so we can be coordinating with FEMA, not duplicating, but coordinating on who can best provide what resource. And one of the things we always want to say is that deployment of resources and reimbursement, because through EMAC reimbursement is guaranteed, are independent of FEMA and any funds that may be received through a presidential disaster declaration. States that request resources are obligated to pay the cost of those resources, whether they receive a presidential or not. And we just, as always, and as we try and do in the emergency management field, know your neighbors and know what surrounding states have to offer in the event you're impacted by a catastrophic disaster. A couple more things about the FEMA-EMAC relationship. EMAC doesn't replace or diminish the need for federal assistance. Those often run in parallel tracks. EMAC resources might be utilized first, and then you receive federal assistance or vice versa. In both cases, it's a force multiplier for everyone who's involved in providing resources. As you know, FEMA is often impacted in several FEMA regions at once, so any resources that could be provided by member states through the EMAC system helps reduce the need for federal resources. And again, EMAC reimbursements may be eligible through the FEMA reimbursement if there's a federal declaration, but you do pay for those resources regardless of a federal declaration or not. As we talk about unsolicited donations can be the second disaster. That is often the case with self-deploying resources. We do not encourage self-deployment. Those response efforts are often, as you know, a very well-coordinated dance at the local level, and you throw a lot of extra resources in there that they don't know what to do with, that they aren't expecting, that they haven't planned for. It can be very hard for them to support those resources. Responders can become victims if we're not careful of how and where we're utilizing our resources. Response efforts can be disrupted as you're trying to fit all these things you didn't ask for or didn't even know you needed into a system. And they do create a burden for all those folks who are trying to manage this as efficiently as possible. We encourage deployment of resources through established way to provide a resource. Be sure to fit within and work within the system. This is just a quick little snapshot of what a REQ-A document looks like. Resource providers will be reimbursed for eligible costs listed on the REQ-A. When we talked about the Mission Ready package earlier, all those components and parts then become the cost estimates that are utilized on the REQ-A. It is a legally binding written agreement about resource sharing between requesting and assisting states. Each state has authorized representatives who can sign this document on behalf of their state. All those are on a password-protected portion of the EMAC website. And keeping in mind that this is an estimate at this point, you're doing your best guess estimate, but reimbursement down the road is on actual eligible costs of that mission performed. I want to get into a little bit about some of the highlights of those 13 articles of agreement that we referenced earlier in the webinar. The key one to remember, and this is not, it's just a reiteration, it does require a governor's declaration in the impacted state. As we said, that's the activating mechanism in that impacted state. One exception to that is that we all know we practice like we play, so we encourage the use of EMAC during exercises, and when it is being utilized in an exercise, a governor's declaration is not required at that time. However, you may want to simulate that so you don't remember that piece in a real-world event. We, again, member state responsibilities pre-plan with surrounding states so you know what resources they have, what they might be able to provide. And we do want you to identify all available resources within your state and encourage them to be deployable through EMAC. One of the key things that Iowa did during Hurricane Katrina, their labs were destroyed, so newborn screening was not able to be performed. Iowa actually did that testing at a lab here in the state, and the samples were sent to that lab on a daily basis. That then caused a lot of other labs to look at what would we do in a similar type situation. So we have had exercises with numerous surrounding states who have developed kind of that mission-ready package on what kind of services would we need, what would be the cost, what kind of sampling or testing would we need done. and then looking at how they can be prepared if something similar would happen in their state. All right, getting more to articles of agreement, some limitations. Resources necessary to protect the assisting state may be withheld, or they can be called back. In the case of hurricanes, and I think this was maybe in 2004 when Francis, Charlie, Ivan, Jean were going across the southern United States, Texas had deployed some resources, and then they believed they were going to be impacted, so they recalled those resources to protect their own state. Had they not been deployed in the first place, they would not have been required to them. So you can either withhold resources or call them back if they are deployed if you need them home to protect your own state. Those assisting state forces are under the command and control of the regular leadership in your state, but they're under the operational control of the folks in the state where they are helping out. EMAC does have an article addressing license reciprocity so that requesting states will accept licenses, permits, and certifications from other states. It also addresses liability. Employees of the assisting state are considered agents of the requesting state for tort liability and immunity, so that transfers to that requesting state. However, work comp and death benefits stay with your home state when you deploy to another state, because there are many variables on those protections, so we want to make sure that those are protected by your home state. And as long as employees are acting in good faith, they will likely not run into any issues with liability. But again, nice thing about the compact, it does address reimbursement, work comp, death benefits, liability, license reciprocity, all those key elements. As I mentioned earlier, one of those commonly requested resources is National Guard. Article 1, under Purpose and Authorities, authorizes use of National Guard for humanitarian purposes, and that's a key point to remember, humanitarian purposes. Article 13, an additional provision, states the National Guard personnel may not be deployed for military purposes outside their state. So again, it's a humanitarian purpose, not a, I'm armed and I'm going to protect a perimeter. That is not allowed under this. And the National Guard may deploy through EMAC in either state active duty status or Title 32 status. Some ways to learn more about EMAC. We listed the EMAC website there, www.emacweb.org. There is an online Understanding EMAC course on that site, and there is also a course Understanding EMAC E431, which is taught at the Emergency Management Institute. And we're continually evaluating our training available and adjusting to meet the needs. So it's an ongoing process. We always have turnover. We always have additional training needed. Some of the things we encourage you to do, and we have provided a base presentation for local officials to state emergency management offices, so we encourage you to coordinate with them, have those discussions. They can then provide information on state policies, laws, and procedures concerning EMAC and how it operates within their state, so that this can then become kind of a customizable for use within your state, and it then incorporates all these state laws and policies there. This is also a good time to talk with them about mission-ready package development. How can you best fit into that system and be ready to go with a developed mission-ready package so you can quickly deploy when the resource is needed. This is all a part of pre-event planning, and we encourage that in support of emergency management nationwide. We talked a little bit about exercises with EMAC earlier and how it can be utilized, and we encourage it to be utilized during exercises. Local jurisdictions can exercise as if they are receiving a resource or even providing a resource through EMAC. We encourage incorporating EMAC into federal and state mandated exercise programs as well. Again, it's that practice like you play, and we know that at some point most of us will have a disaster of the magnitude that we will need resources from partners outside our state. We have arrived at the question and answer portion of our webinar. On the phone with me today are Tom and Connie. As you see there, Tom is with the International City County Management Association, and Connie is with the National League of Cities. Angela Copple is also on the webinar. We would be glad to address any questions at this point. I see a question here where they ask about making the presentation available via email, and we will send this out to attendees following the webinar.
Our next question asks if a person employed from a local government has to be a temporary agent of the state in order to deploy under EMAC.
I would be glad to take that question. They do have to be a temporary agent of the state. It is a state-to-state mutual aid compact, and each state hopefully has identified a way to make local resources agents of the state so they're deployable through the EMAC system.
Okay, our next question, is there a training requirement for participants to be in an EMAC mission-ready package?
I will jump in again. This is Joyce, and then Angela, if you have anything to add. We do not have any specific training requirements at a national level. There may be requirements at the state level for that. However, I believe most mission-ready packages are comprised of individuals who have met some kind of criteria, whether it's a local firefighter, a local first responder, a gentleman who's authorized to run a chainsaw. So those certifications are normally up to the individual state.
Okay, our next question, is EMAC only available after a Stafford Act presidential disaster declaration?
No. EMAC is available whenever a governor of an impacted state has declared a disaster. It has truly nothing to do with a presidential except for the potential of reimbursement through that Stafford Act declaration.
All right, our next one looks more like a statement than a question. It says, Army National Guard may be deployed out of the state for military purposes under Title 10. And while I don't disagree with the statement, it can only be deployed under EMAC under Title 32 and state active duty and under the President's control under Title 10. So I'm going to move on to our next question. Are cities automatically included in EMAC or mainly counties only?
This is Connie. It's typical that city leaders are tied, at least we hope they're tied, well and truly into the county response system. The local emergency management system, of course, larger cities tend to have their own Department of Emergency Services or emergency management, but you know, most of America is smaller cities, and those cities are part of the county structure, and then the county reports to the state. And so typically a city would notify the county emergency management system division, whatever that looks like, and those folks would handle through the state, which may include an EMAC response.
And this is Tom. One of the things that cities may be able to do is join together to create a mission-ready package that could be mobilized, but again, it would be through either their county emergency management agency to the state, or if their city is big enough, obviously directly.
And Tom and Connie both have excellent points, and from a state perspective as well, it is a state-to-state compact, so as they said, you need to fit into that system of city to county to state, and make sure you work with your state emergency management office, develop those mission-ready packages so they can be deployable.
Joyce, this is Connie again. I think just in case we have local officials in this webinar that don't have deep experience with emergency response, I always encourage people to look into their own jurisdictions, check it out and find out who your partners are beforehand. During a disaster is a terrible time to be developing relationships and trying to sort out really who's in charge, who should be doing what.
Absolutely. Excellent point.
Our next question, are private sector resources part of the EMAC process? In some cases, states have the ability to deploy some private sector resources and other states do not, so it really comes down to that state's laws. In general, because you do have to be an agent of the state would have to have some sort of mechanism, such as an MOU, a memorandum of agreement, to make that asset a temporary agent of the state.
A lot of states will contract for resources when they get into this type of a catastrophic event because oftentimes those may be reimbursable through the federal government under a Stafford Act declaration. However, as Angela said, it's all about identifying the resources ahead of time and making sure there is a mechanism to make them agents of the state to be deployable through the EMAC system.
All right, our next question, are all the appropriate documents to enter into EMAC available on the EMAC website listed in the presentation?
They are not on the publicly available website. Mission Ready package development is out there. However, that REQ-A form that we referenced that becomes the legally binding contract, there are only certain individuals at each state emergency management office that are authorized to complete and sign that form, so that form is not available.
All right, next question. As a county office of emergency management, how can we, on a step-by-step process, become part of the EMAC system? It seems like our state needs to take the lead before we can really take any action within EMAC.
Well, it is, as has been pointed out, a state-to-state compact. My assumption is that all county emergency management entities are connected directly into the state, whatever that state department or division looks like. And if not, there needs to be that direct connection. But to my knowledge, and Angela, perhaps you can correct me if I'm off track here, but I don't know of a direct membership. EMAC is a state-to-state mutual aid compact, so it requires state agreement first.
Correct.
And again, I would just chime in that it all gets back to relationship building. Your county emergency management personnel should be regularly meeting with their state, and your state should know equally well your people, so that in the case of a disaster, it's not a foreign country coming in, that you've already got that relationship, that they know what you need, and it's a two-way street. So make sure that your emergency management people are interacting with the state, because that'll be the direction it travels.
And I think I would like to add on that point as well that I think while we encourage two-way communication and partnership all the time, it comes back to identifying what resources at the local level you're willing to share. Because if I at the state reach out to one of my counties and say, well, hey, I understand you've got 5 communications trailers, can I deploy those through EMAC? It's up to that county or that local jurisdiction to decide what resources they're willing to offer up. So having those sit-downs like Tom and Connie are talking about and just having that discussion is, in my opinion, the best way to move forward with that if you have resources you'd like to share.
Right. Our next question, who actually fills out the REQ-A forms?
I will start on that one. In each state, besides there being an authorized rep who can sign those forms obligating money or resources on behalf of the state, there is a designated contact. Those designated contacts are individuals who have had specific training on the system, the process, on how to do this, so that they are the ones who will actually work with the resource providers to complete the paperwork, get it signed by the appropriate parties, and submit it through the online system. And that's at the State Emergency Management Office.
This is a great question. What are some of the common EMAC pitfalls, and how can cities and locals and states avoid them?
This is Connie. I'd love to at least start that one. I think part of the problem is self-deployment and not using the system. My observation is the EMAC system works very well, but the biggest problems happen with that lack of coordination and people just deciding to take off with a fire truck and frequently that ends up to be a part of the problem instead of a part of the assistance.
I kind of echo in on what Connie said, having talked to a number of communities. If your people self-deploy, they can actually create a new crisis for the community that's already dealing with one, because you've got to remember, all of a sudden they've got more people coming into their area looking for housing, shelter, food, in some cases gasoline that may be scarce. So it's important to use the EMAC system because those logistics are thought out ahead of time. And you really don't want to add more problems to somebody that you're going to help, nor do you want somebody adding to yours.
And just a couple, those are great feedback, and a couple to add on to that from the perspective we see at the state level often is expectations. Sometimes people don't know what to expect when they're deploying, so it's good to make sure that you have a briefing and talk with deploying resources about their mission, because oftentimes you'll get to one area, and we had this happen with some folks who deployed to the East Coast last year. They had not done this before. They were great at their profession, but they had not deployed through the system, so they didn't know really what to expect. So we realized that we needed to do a better briefing for them ahead of time to know what to expect, make sure everybody keeps documentation of costs and expenses, and then make sure that everybody reports back, checks in, because a big thing we find too is accountability with deployed personnel moving through the system, especially in a large disaster.
One other pitfall I know that came up in New Jersey, you need to also, when you're preparing your emergency response plans, think of things that may be required of people coming in to assist you. For instance, law enforcement. Do you have to swear them in? Can they work under the color of your people's badge? Can they, or do you need to put them through some training? And that became an issue in, I think it was with the state of New Jersey, that they had to, there were some requirements in their enabling legislation that did not allow for police coming in. So again, look at all of those things. Are there going to be special requirements? And deal with those up front if you can.
Excellent. Our next question, are states encouraged to reimburse local government expenses while waiting for full compensation of mission reimbursement for any event? Reimbursement can take a significantly long amount of time. And Joyce, I think either one of us could take this one. I'll go ahead and have you kick us off.
Very good. Reimbursement is one of those things that it's state by state. Everybody has a different process, different time lengths, or different capabilities for getting to this. One of the things I always encourage people to remember is you're waiting for reimbursement from a state who just went through a catastrophic disaster event, and any of us at the state level who have been through this know that it can just be overwhelming, and then you throw in all these extra reimbursements on top of that. I think a good thing to do, and I know New Jersey did this, they sent out, this is what I need from you, this is where to send it to in order to get a reimbursement through the system as quickly as possible. And I know for Iowa, I think we received a reimbursement within like less than 45 days. It was extremely quick. But we also need to keep in mind, too, that there are some states who personnel may change during a disaster, and then you're starting from scratch on training people and getting a system going. So there are all kinds of pitfalls. But again, having good records, good documentation, and then as a state who brought resources in, making sure everyone knows how to submit and what your requirements are so that everyone can meet those requirements and speed the process.
Joyce, it's Connie. Would it be fair to say that if these relationships are built ahead of time and the local officials, whether they're county or city officials, understand what the reimbursement requirements typically are, everybody understands how very important it is to have documentation. And sometimes I think part of the problem here is managing people's expectations, because local governments, especially with all of our smaller jurisdictions, don't have a lot of cash lying around, and so sometimes they really need to have that money to continue operating, and yet it hasn't worked its way through the system. So I think part of the issue can be expectations and need, but it's also sometimes if people understand the system ahead of time, they become aware of tools like a public finance authority within a state that has the ability to issue temporary funding to the jurisdiction to literally pay salaries until the reimbursement happens. But that's part of that relationship development piece, I think.
And Connie, I think you raised an excellent point about managing expectations. The one thing I will add to that as well is, again, with this being a state-to-state compact, depending on the financial position of the state, some states will pay their local jurisdiction immediately upon return once they've reviewed their packet. Then the state is the one waiting for reimbursement from the other state, not that local jurisdiction. So again, it comes back to what is a state process and a state procedure, and that's important to work with your state to know that as well.
Yep, great answers. Our next question, are safety standards, for example, federal OSHA and state OSHA programs, held to those of the requesting state or the sending state?
I will throw out my opinion, and somebody can correct me if they have a different opinion. Since you're under the operational command and control of that state you're responding to, I would assume you would be under the OSHA requirements of that state.
I would agree with that answer. Our next question, and I'm not sure that I've ever had it asked to me exactly this way, does EMAC waive collective bargaining and or union agreement?
I will start out, and then Tom or Connie, any additional that you guys have. EMAC provides the capability. It does not waive any contract or collective bargaining agreements that I'm aware of. If I have employees who work for me who deploy and they get overtime at premium rate, time and a half, that is what they still would get while they're deploying. However, the variable is that I, as the state of Iowa, can say, I'm only going to charge you for their overtime because I'd be paying them their regular time anyway. So there are always variables in that cost estimate where sometimes states will donate a portion of the cost, or there have even been cases where they don't charge just to get their staff the experience or to get their resource deployed. So those collective bargaining agreements must still be honored, because at the end of the day, I'm paying those employees and then asking for reimbursement from whatever state they deploy to.
Exactly. That's exactly how I interpret it as well. Our next question is, does the city have to enroll in this program in order to receive EMAC assistance?
Okay, I'll jump in. Talking again about that emergency management system that we have looked at, if you have a city or county who is impacted, they don't have enough or the right resources, whatever means available to them, they're then going to come to their state office. If that state office does not then have the right resources, they're either going to look to federal resources or EMAC resources, or in some cases, you know, maybe we're purchasing something or renting something to meet the need of that local jurisdiction. I do not believe there is any way that they would be enrolled to use that, and making sure that that impacted jurisdiction is getting the resources they need.
Right, and by law, states are required in the EMAC Articles of Agreement to make all resources within their state available to other states. So they do have some requirements where they are to look at all cities and counties' resources, and of course, they're there to support those same entities when they need resources come in. Our next question, if a requesting local jurisdiction is unable to repay deployed resources, is the host state then required to reimburse the cost to the other state?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, there is no cost to the local jurisdiction. At least I'll speak for Iowa. In Iowa, if we go to another state to get resources in support of a local jurisdiction, we pay the cost for those resources. There is not the expectation the locals pay that cost.
All right, our next question, do EMAC requests need to be resource type? Not necessarily is the answer. You can resource type, or if your resource does not meet the NIMS resource typing standards, you do not have to resource type that. We typically request resources by what capability needs to be filled. If that could further be defined by adding the resource type, then that's acceptable. All of those, kind of a blanket general description, and also the resource typing is included on the EMAC REQ-A, but not required. Our next question is, what is the time frame given for reimbursement to assisting states?
Through the EMAC system, we have developed some reimbursement guidelines, and again, they're only guidelines because each state has a different process. What we hope is that they will be reimbursed within, was it 45 days, Angela?
Correct, okay. 45 days. And as a side note to that, New Jersey did an excellent job of managing the reimbursement process during Hurricane Sandy. Their record is actually 12 days from receipt of the reimbursement package to having the check sent out, and their average is actually 16 days for all the reimbursements that have been given to the state of New Jersey. So we have really been focusing a lot on the process of reimbursement, encouraging states to process them quickly. It's definitely a focus area for us, and we certainly will continue to follow that up.
Angela, if I could.
All right, go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, just one more point on that. One of the things that people often forget about in the EMAC process is, you know, we're in the response and that's where the focus is. When you get to the recovery, you may have a need for some of those financial support people. I'll just give a shout out to Victoria Carpenter from Louisiana, who has an excellent reimbursement process in place. She actually deployed to New Jersey to help them set up and organize their system. So that's a thing for states to remember, is that there is support in that area as well in the aftermath of the immediate response.
Right. Our next question, can tribal entities participate in EMAC? Tribal entities cannot be signatories to the compact. However, some states have made tribes part of EMAC by considering them a county for the purposes of emergency management. So in that case, the tribal nation would be considered a county and then part of the EMAC process to send or receive resources. Of course, if there is a responsible party, such that happened in, I think it was North Carolina in the past, where there was actually a gas leak, a gasoline leak in a river that contaminated the water supply. Because there was a responsible party, the state did not call EMAC resources or federal resources in. That responsible party was made to clean that up. And our next question, whose workers' compensation would the agent of the state be covered under?
Workers' compensation, as we referenced in the webinar, along with death benefits, is the same as if you were working in your home state. You are protected by your home state's coverage while you are deployed.
All right, and our next question, what if the deployed responder is a volunteer? Are volunteers reimbursed for their time?
I'll start off with this one that, again, this is one of those that there's no yes or no answer to. It is handled according to whatever state policies are. In Iowa, it's harder for us to make a volunteer a temporary agent of the state. So it would come back to what are your state laws and policies on making that resource a temporary agent of the state, and then determining what is a fair rate for them, that kind of thing.
Great. Our next question, as a volunteer fire department that would like to develop an MRP for deployment, would we be eligible to deploy under EMAC?
Yes, If you can work with your state emergency management office and they're willing to do that and do not have any restrictions in state law or policies that allow that, certainly.
Okay, great. Our next question is backfill for deployed personnel eligible for reimbursement under EMAC. I know that we do not allow this in our state. What about other states?
This has been a lot of discussion over time on backfill, and most states have gotten to the point where they do not authorize backfill. Again, that comes down to what the state is willing to pay, and that is something that we always tell people, if you put it in the REQ-A and it's approved, then that is okay, but it may likely be kicked out because a lot of states are saying we don't want to pay backfill because those costs can become pretty significant.
And the next question, what if the local insurance is better than the state? And I'm not entirely sure what we're talking about here. If it is a workers' compensation question or if it's a general coverage question. And Joyce, you might have more insights, or Connie or Tom might have more insights into that question than I do, being on that level.
My perspective on that is, since you are a temporary agent of the state, you are then governed by the coverages that the state has in place during your deployment.
Joyce, it's Connie. My suggestion would be anyone that has a question about that, and because I work with cities, I'm going to say cities typically have access to an insurance pool. And so you may want to check with your specific pool manager or your carrier and or your state to find out what insurance questions need to be answered.
And this is Tom. I agree with Connie, and they may cover any gaps or fill in any gaps through your pool policy.
That's a good point. Thank you, guys.
Connie or Tom, if any of you have any closing comments?
Well, I would like to thank all of our friends at NEMA for putting this webinar together. I work with the National League of Cities, but I'm a state municipal league director by day, and I know from personal experience, because of the disasters in our state, how important it is for people to develop those relationships beforehand. And it's particularly important for city and county officials to work together. I know that's not always the case, but let's all try harder.
Well, and on behalf of ICMA, I too would like to thank our partners in putting this presentation on. It's an extremely important topic. We are coming into the storm season, the hurricane seasons, and all wildfires. It's very important for managers and local government officials to know what steps have to be taken if they need help, or what steps should be taken if they're going to send help. Because the last thing you really want to do in a disaster is create another one. It's just not something that's helping your neighbors. So we think this is a very important topic. Again, there's a lot of information, and you'll find the folks at NEMA and EMAC extremely willing to help you, and I think you'll also find your state agencies as well as good resources.
Excellent. And I will just thank everyone for participating in the webinar. I know we had great attendance today, and hopefully it provided you with some good information. It is truly a system, and we need, in a catastrophic disaster, we need everybody's help through that system to make it work. So if you are not sure who your emergency management folks are, there is a place on the EMAC website where you can find out who the points of contact are for your state. So thank you for your participation. And Angela, final words.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and also thank Joyce, Connie, and Tom for helping us out on the questions today. And thank you again, and have a great rest of the day.